I'm doing an audiobook, so please comment below any critique. Foreword. The occult was in the forefront of Jung's interest from the very beginning of his professional career and before. At the behest of his chief, the great psychiatrist Eugen Bleuler, Jung wrote his MD dissertation on the psychology and pathology of so-called occult phenomena, published in 1902 and evidently composed after he became an assistant physician at the Burgolzi Hospital in 1900. In psychiatric terms, he described several clinical cases of double consciousness, twilight states, and somnambulism, then presented in detail the case of an adolescent girl medium whose seances he had witnessed in the mid-1890s. He sought to account clinically for the visions experienced by this young woman and cites the theory of cryptomnesia, the coming into consciousness of unrecognized memory images, a reference obviously to the unconscious. In Jung's conclusion to the monograph, there is an allusion to what sounds very close to the collective unconscious. I waded through the occult literature, so far as it pertained to the subject, the root idea of the girl's visions, and discovered the wealth of parallels with our agnostic system, dating from different centuries, but scattered about in all kinds of works, most of them quite inaccessible to the patient. Several years later, in 1897, while an undergraduate at Basel University, Jung discussed the occult in a lecture to Zofingia University Society, a student club. Speaking in 1897 on the general subject of psychology, the 22-year-old Jung said that the soul does exist, it is intelligent and immortal, not subject to time and space. He declared the reality of spirits and spiritualism on the evidence of telekinesis, messages of dying people, hypnotism, clairvoyance, second sight, and prophetic dreams. In February 1905, Jung gave a lecture at his alma mater, Basel University, on spiritualistic phenomena, a lengthy discourse in which he surveyed the history and psychology of the subject in America and England, as well as on the continent. He drew upon a broad age of literature: Schopenhauer, Swedenborg, Mesmer, Kant, Kerner, Krafft-Ebing, and the famous English physicist Sir William Crookes, whose observations of levitation had impressed Jung particularly. Jung himself had investigated 8 mediums in Zurich. In general, he was unimpressed, diagnosing both hysteria and auto-hypnosis in most instances. 2.5 years later, in a letter of November 2, 1907, Jung told Freud that because of his services as an occultist, he had been elected an honorary fellow of the American Society for Psychical Research, nearly 2 years before he visited America. He goes on, "In this capacity, I have been dabbling in spookery again. Here too your discoveries are brilliantly confirmed. What do you think about this whole field of research?" Unfortunately, Freud's letter in reply is one of the few that's missing. On April 12, 1909, just after Jung's second visit to Freud in Vienna, he writes of a case he is analyzing, in which first-rate spiritualistic phenomena occur, and another that involves the evil eye, and goes on to refer glancingly to his spookery during his last evening with Freud. This was the episode of the poltergeist knocking in Freud's bookcase, which Freud mentioned skeptically in his answering letter. "My dear son, keep a cool head, for it is better not to understand something than make such great sacrifices to understanding." Jung gave a full account only 50 years later in Memories, Dreams, Reflections. Ernest Jones, in his Life of Freud, relates that when Freud and Jung met in Munich on December 26, 1910, they had a long talk about occultism, and Freud was not surprised to hear that Jung had long been fully convinced of the reality of telepathy, and had carried out most convincing experiments himself. In a letter of May 8, 1911, Jung writes, "The meeting in Munich is still very much on my mind. Occultism is another field we shall have to conquer. With the aid of the libido theory, it seems to me. At the moment I am looking into astrology, which seems indispensable for a proper understanding of mythology. There are strange and wondrous things in these lands of darkness. Please don't worry about my wanderings in these infinitudes. I shall return laden, with rich booty for our knowledge of the human psyche. For a while longer I must intoxicate myself on magic perfumes in order to fathom the secrets that lie hidden in the abysses of the unconscious." This was the letter to which Freud gave a famous reply, 12 May 1911. I am aware that you are driven by innermost inclination to the study of the occult, and I am sure you will return home richly laden. I cannot argue with that. It is always right to go where your impulses lead. You will be accused of mysticism, but the reputation you won with the dementia will hold up for some time against that. Just don't stay in the tropical colonies too long. You must write at home. And a month later, astrology again, 12 June 1911. My evenings are taken up very largely with astrology. I make horoscopic calculations in order to find a clue to the core of psychological truth. Some remarkable things have turned up, which will certainly appear incredible to you. I dare say that we shall one day discover in astrology a good deal of knowledge that has been intuitively projected into the heavens. For instance, it appears that the signs of the zodiac are character pictures. In other words, libido symbols, which depict the typical qualities of the libido at any given moment. Freud's reply, 15 June 1911, sounds rather fatigued. In matters of occultism, I have grown humble since the great lesson Ferenczi's experiences gave me. I promise to believe anything that can be made to look reasonable. I shall not do so gladly, that you know, but my hubris has been shattered. The present selection includes several further and shorter works of Jung's on the subject of the occult. Written between 1919 and 1957, his foreword to a collection of 3 of these studies, translated into French, forms an introduction to the volume in hand. There are numerous references to occultism also to be found in Jung's letters. Foreword to Jung, Phenomenes Occultes. The essays together, collected in this volume, were written over a period of 30 years, the first in 1902 and the last in 1932. The reason why I am bringing them out together is that all 3 are concerned with certain borderline problems of the human psyche, the question of the soul's existence after death. The first essay gives an account of a young, somnambulistic girl who claimed to be in communication with the spirits of the departed. The second essay deals with the problem of dissociation and part souls, or splinter personalities. The third discusses the psychology of the belief in immortality and the possibility of the continued existence of the soul after death. The point of view I have adopted is that of modern, empirical psychology and the scientific method. Although these essays deal with subjects which usually fall within the province of philosophy or theology, it would be a mistake to assume that psychology is concerned with the metaphysical nature of the problem of immortality. Psychology cannot establish any metaphysical truths, nor does it try to. It is concerned solely with the phenomenology of the psyche. The idea of immortality is a psychic phenomenon that is disseminated over the whole earth. Every idea is, from the psychological point of view, a phenomenon, just as is philosophy or theology. For modern psychology, ideas are entities, like animals and plants. The scientific method consists in the description of nature. All mythological ideas are essentially real, and far older than any philosophy. Like our knowledge of physical nature, they were originally perceptions and experiences. Insofar as such ideas are universal, they are symptoms, or characteristics, or normal exponents of psychic life, which are naturally present and need no proof of their truth. The only question we can profitably discuss is whether they are universal or not. If they are universal, they belong to the natural constituents and normal structure of the psyche, and if by any chance they are not encountered in the subconscious mind of a given individual, then they are present in the unconscious, and the case is an abnormal one. The fewer of these universal ideas are found in consciousness, the more of them there will be in the unconscious, and the greater will be their influence on the conscious mind. This state of things already bears some resemblance to a neurotic disturbance. It is normal to think about immortality, and abnormal not to do so or not to be bothered about it. If everybody eats salt, then that is a normal thing to do, and is abnormal not to, but this tells us nothing about the rightness of eating salt or of the idea of immortality. That is a question which, strictly speaking, has nothing to do with psychology. Immortality cannot be proved any more than can the existence of God, either philosophically or empirically. We know that salt is indispensable for our physiological health. We do not eat salt for this reason, however. but because food with salt in it tastes better. We can easily imagine that long before there was any philosophy, human beings had instinctively found out what ideas were necessary for the normal functioning of the psyche. Only a rather stupid mind will try to go beyond that and to venture an opinion on whether immortality does or does not exist. This question cannot be asked for the simple reason that it cannot be discussed. More important, it misses the essential point, which is the functional value of the idea as such. If a person does not believe in salt, it is up to the doctor to tell him that salt is necessary for physiological health. Equally, it seems to me that the doctor of the soul should not go along with the fashionable stupidities, but should remind his patient what the normal structural elements of the psyche are. For reasons of psychic hygiene, it would be better not to forget these original universal ideas, and wherever they have disappeared, from neglect or intellectual bigotry, we should reconstruct them as quickly as we can, regardless of philosophical proofs, for or against, which are impossible anyway. In general, the heart seems to have a more reliable memory for what benefits the psyche than does the head, which has a rather unhealthy tendency to lead an abstract existence and easily forgets that its consciousness is snuffed out the moment the heart fails in its duty. Ideas are not just counters used by the calculating mind. They are also golden vessels, full of living feeling. Freedom is not a mere abstraction, it is also an emotion. Reason becomes unreason when separated from the heart, and the psychic life void of universal ideas sickens from undernourishment. The Buddha said, "These four are the foodstuffs, yabikus, which sustain the creatures that are born and benefit the creatures that seek rebirth. The first is edible food, coarse or fine. Touch is the second, the thinking capacity of the mind is the third, and the fourth is consciousness." On the psychology and pathology of so-called occult phenomena. Introduction. In that wide domain of psychopathic inferiority, from which science has marked off the clinical pictures of epilepsy, hysteria, and neurasthenia, we find scattered observations on certain rare states of consciousness as to whose meaning the authors have not yet agreed. These observations crop up sporadically in the literature on narcolepsy, lethargy, aromatisme ambulatoire, periodic amnesia, double consciousness, somnambulism, pathological dreaminess, pathological lying, etc. The above-mentioned states are sometimes attributed to epilepsy, sometimes to hysteria, sometimes to exhaustion of the nervous system, neurasthenia, and sometimes they may even be accorded the dignity of a disease sui generis. The patients concerned occasionally go through the whole gamut of diagnoses, from epilepsy to hysteria, and simulated insanity. It is in fact exceedingly difficult and sometimes impossible to distinguish these states from the various types of neurosis, but on the other hand, certain features point beyond pathological inferiority to something more than a merely analogical relationship with the phenomena of normal psychology, and even with the psychology of the supernormal, that of genius. However varied the individual phenomena may be in themselves, there is certainly no case that cannot be related by means of some intermediate case to others that are typical. This relationship extends deep into the clinical pictures of hysteria and epilepsy. Recently, it has even been suggested that there is no definite borderline between epilepsy and hysteria, and that a difference becomes apparent only in extreme cases. Stephens, for example, says, "We are forced to the conclusion that in essence hysteria and epilepsy are not fundamentally different, that the cause of the disease is the same, only it manifests itself in different forms and in different degrees of insanity and duration. The delimitation of hysteria and certain borderline forms of epilepsy from congenital or acquired psychopathic inferiority likewise presents great difficulties. The symptoms overlap at every point, so that violence is done to the facts if they are regarded separately as belonging to this or that particular group. To delimit psychopathic inferiority from the normal is an absolutely impossible task, for the difference is always only more or less. Classification in the field of inferiority itself meets with the same difficulties. At best, one can only single out certain groups, which crystallize around a nucleus with specially marked typical features. If we disregard the two large groups of intellectual and emotional inferiority, we are left with those which are colored preeminently by hysterical, epileptic, epileptoid, or neurasthenic symptoms, and which are not characterized by an inferiority either of intellect or of emotion. It is chiefly in this field, insusceptible of any sure classification, that the above-mentioned states are to be found. As is well known, they can appear as partial manifestations of a typical epilepsy or hysteria, or can exist separately as psychopathic inferiorities, in which case the qualification, epileptic or hysterical, is often due to relatively unimportant subsidiary symptoms. Thus, somnambulism is usually classed among the hysterical illnesses because it is sometimes a partial manifestation of severe hysteria, or because it may be accompanied by milder, so-called hysterical symptoms. Binet says, somnambulism is not one particular and unchanging nervous condition. There are many somnambulisms. As a partial manifestation of severe hysteria, somnambulism is not an unknown phenomenon, but as a separate pathological entity, a disease sui generis. It must be somewhat rare, to judge by the paucity of German literature on this subject. So-called spontaneous somnambulism, based on a slightly hysterical psychopathic inferiority, is not very common, and it is worthwhile to examine such cases more closely, as they sometimes afford us a wealth of interesting observations. Case of Miss E., aged 40, single, bookkeeper in a large business. No hereditary taint, except that a brother suffered from nerves, quote-unquote nerves, after a family misfortune and illness. Good education, of a cheerful disposition, not able to save money, always had some big idea in my head. She was very kind-hearted and gentle, did a great deal for her parents who were living in modest circumstances and for strangers. Nevertheless, she was not happy because she felt she was misunderstood. She had always enjoyed good health till a few years ago, when she said she was treated for dilatation of the stomach and tapeworm. During this illness, her hair turned rapidly white. Later, she had typhoid. An engagement was terminated by the death of her fiancé from paralysis. She was in a highly nervous state for a year and a half. In the summer of 1897, she went away for a change of air and hydrotherapy. She herself said that for about a year there were moments in her work where her thoughts seemed to stand still, though she did not fall asleep. She made no mistakes in her accounts, however. In the street, she often went to the wrong place and then suddenly realized that she was not in the right street. She had no giddiness or fainting fits. Formerly, menstruation occurred regularly every 4 weeks with no bother. Lately, since she was nervous and overworked, every 14 days. For a long time, she suffered from constant headache. As accountant and bookkeeper in a large business, she had a very strenuous job, which she did well and conscientiously. In the present year, in addition to the strains of her work, she had all sorts of new worries. Her brother suddenly got divorced, and besides her own work, she looked after his housekeeping, nursed him and his child through a serious illness, and so on. To recuperate, she went on September 13 to see a woman friend in southern Germany. Her great joy at seeing her friend again after such a long absence, and their celebration of a party, made the necessary rest impossible. On the 15th, quite contrary to her usual habit, she and her friend drank a whole bottle of claret. Afterwards, they went for a walk in the cemetery, where she began to tear up flowers and scratch at the graves. She remembered absolutely nothing of this afterwards. On the 16th, she stayed with her friend without anything of importance happening. On the 17th, her friend brought her to Zurich. An acquaintance came with her to the asylum. On the way, she talked quite sensibly, but was very tired. Outside the asylum, they met 3 boys, whom she described as 3 dead people she had dug up. She then wanted to go to the neighboring cemetery, and only with difficulty would be persuaded to enter the asylum. The patient was small, delicately built, slightly anemic. Left side of the heart slightly enlarged. No murmurs, but a few double beats. Accentuated sounds in the mitral region. The liver dullness extended only to the edge of the upper ribs. Patellar reflexes rather brisk, but otherwise no tendon reflexes. No anesthesia or analgesia, no paralysis. Rough examination of the field of vision with the hands showed no restriction. Hair of a very pale, yellowish-white color. On the whole, the patient looked her age. She recounted her history and the events of the last few days quite clearly, but had no recollection of what happened in the cemetery at sea or outside the asylum. During the night of the 17th, 18th, she spoke to the attendant and said she saw the whole room full of dead people looking like skeletons. She was not at all frightened, but was rather surprised that the attendant did not see them too. Once she ran to the window, but was otherwise quiet. The next morning in bed, she still saw skeletons, but not in the afternoon. The following night, she woke up at 4 o'clock and heard the dead children in the adjoining cemetery crying out that they had been buried alive. She wanted to go and dig them up, but allowed herself to be restrained. Next morning at 7 o'clock, she was still delirious, but could now remember quite well the events in the cemetery at sea and on her way to the asylum. She said that at sea she wanted to dig up the dead children who were calling to her. She had only torn up the flowers in order to clear the graves and be able to open them. While she was in this state, Professor Blauler explained to her that she would remember everything afterwards too, when she came to herself again. The patient slept for a few hours in the morning. Afterwards she was quite clear-headed and felt fairly well. She did indeed remember the attacks, but maintained a remarkable indifference towards them. The following nights, except on those of September 22 and 25, she again had short attacks of delirium in which she had to deal with the dead, though the attacks differed in detail. Twice she saw dead people in her bed. She did not appear to be frightened of them, but got out of bed as to not embarrass them. Several times she tried to leave the room. After a few nights free from the attacks, she had a mild one on September 30, where she called to the dead from the window. During the day, her mind was quite clear. On October 3rd, while fully conscious, as she related afterwards, she saw a whole crowd of skeletons in the drawing room. Although she doubted the reality of the skeletons, she could not convince herself that it was an hallucination. The next night, between 12 and 1 o'clock, the earlier attacks usually happened about this time, she was plagued by the dead for about 10 minutes. She sat up in bed, stared into a corner of the room and said, "Now they're coming, but they're not all here yet. Come along, the room's big enough, there's room for all. When they're all here, I'll come too." Then she lay down with the words, "Now they're all here," and fell asleep. In the morning, she had not the slightest recollection of any of these attacks. Very short attacks occurred again on the nights of October 4th, 6th, 9th, 13th, and 15th, all between 12 and 1 o'clock. The last three coincided with the menstrual period. The attendant tried to talk to her several times, showed her the lighted street lamps and the trees, but she did not react to these overtures. Since then, the attacks have stopped altogether. The patient complained about a number of troubles she had had during her stay here. She suffered especially from headaches, and these got worse the morning after the attacks. She said it was unbearable. 5 grains of sac lactis promptly alleviated this. Then she complained of a pain in both forearms, which is described as though it were tendovaginitis. She thought of the bulging of a flexed biceps was a swelling and asked to have it massaged. Actually, there was nothing the matter, and where her complaints were ignored, the trouble disappeared. She complained loud and long about the thickening of a toenail, even after the thickened part had been removed. Sleep was often disturbed. She would not give her consent to be hypnotized against the night attacks. Finally, on account of headache and disturbed sleep, she agreed to hypnotic treatment. She proved a good subject and at the first sitting fell into a deep sleep with analgesia and amnesia. In November, she was again asked whether she could remember the attack of September 19, which it had been suggested she would recall. She had great difficulty recollecting it, and in the end she could only recount the main facts. She had forgotten the details. It remains to be said that the patient was not at all superstitious and in her healthy days had never been particularly interested in the supernatural. All through the treatment, which ended on November 14, she maintained a remarkable indifference, both to the illness and its improvement. The following spring she returned as an outpatient for treatment of the headaches, which had slowly come back because of strenuous work during the intervening months. For the rest, her condition left nothing to be desired. It was established that she had no remembrance of the attacks of the previous autumn, not even those of September 19 and earlier. On the other hand, under hypnosis, she could still give a good account of the events in the cemetery, outside the asylum, and during the night attacks. The peculiar hallucinations and general appearance of our case are reminiscent of those states which Krafft-Ebing describes as protracted states of hysterical delirium. He says, "It is in the mild cases of hysteria that such delirious states occur. Protracted hysterical delirium depends upon temporary exhaustion. Emotional disturbances seem to favor its outbreak. It is prone to relapse. Most frequently, we find delusions of persecution, with often very violent reactive fear, then religious and erotic delusions. Hallucinations of all the senses are not uncommon. The most frequent and most important are delusions of sight, smell, and touch. The visual hallucinations are mostly visions of animals, funerals, fantastic processions swarming with corpses, devils, ghosts, and whatnot. The auditory delusions are simply noises in the ear, shrieks, crashes, bangs, or actual hallucinations, often with sexual content. The corpse visions of our patient and their appearance during attacks remind us of states occasionally observed in hysteroepilepsy. Here too there are specific visions which, in contrast to protracted delirium, are associated with individual attacks. I will give 2 examples. A 30-year-old lady with grand hysterie had delirious twilight states in which she was tormented by frightful hallucinations. She saw her children torn away from her, devoured by wild beasts, etc. She had no remembrance of the individual attacks. A girl of 17, also severe hysteric. In her attacks, she always saw the corpse of her dead mother approaching her, as if to draw her to itself, no memory of the attacks. There are cases of severe hysteria, where consciousness works at a deep dream level. The nature of the attacks and the stability of the hallucinations alone show a certain affinity to our case, which in this respect has numerous analogies with the corresponding states of hysteria, as for instance with cases where a psychic shock, such as rape, occasion the outbreak of hysterical attacks, or where the traumatic event is re-experienced in stereotype hallucinatory form. Our case, however, gets its specific character from the identity of consciousness during the different attacks. It is a second state, with a memory of its own, but separated from the waking state by total amnesia. This distinguishes it from the above-mentioned twilight states and relates it to those found in somnambulism. Charcot divides somnambulism into 2 basic forms. A. Delirium with marked incoordination of ideas and actions. B. Delirium with coordinated actions. This comes nearer to the waking state. Our case belongs to the second group. If by somnambulism we understand a state of systematic partial wakefulness, we must, when discussing this ailment, also consider those isolated attacks of amnesia, which are occasionally observed. Except for noctambulism, they are the simplest states of systematic partial wakefulness. The most remarkable in the literature is undoubtedly Neef's case. It concerns a gentleman of 32 with a bad family history and numerous signs of degeneracy, partly functional, partly organic. As a result of overwork he had, at the early age of 17, a peculiar twilight state with delusions, which lasted a few days and then cleared up with sudden recovery of memory. Later, he was subject to frequent attacks of giddiness, with palpitations and vomiting, but these attacks were never attended by loss of consciousness. At the end of a feverish illness, he suddenly left Australia for Zurich, where he spent some weeks in carefree and merry living, only coming to himself when he read of his sudden disappearance from Australia in the newspapers. He had complete retrograde amnesia for the period of several months that included his journey to Australia, his stay there, and the journey back. A case of periodic amnesia is published by Azam Albert X, 12v4 years old, with hysterical symptoms, had several attacks of amnesia in the course of few years, during which he forgot how to read, write, count, and even how to speak his own language, for weeks at a stretch. In between times, he was normal. A case of automatisme ambulatoire, on a decidedly hysterical basis, but differing from Neef's case, in that the attacks were recurrent, is published by Proust. An educated man, aged 30, exhibited all the symptoms of grand hysteric. He was very suggestible, and from time to time, under the stress of emotional excitement, had attacks of amnesia lasting from 2 days to several weeks. While in these states, he wandered about, visited the relatives, smashed various things in their houses, contracted debts, and was even arrested and convicted for picking pockets. There is a similar case of vagrancy in Botteux. A widow of 22, highly hysterical, became terrified at the prospect of an operation for salmongitis, left the hospital where she had been till then, and fell into a somnambulistic condition, from which she awoke after 3 days with total amnesia. In those 3 days, she had walked about 30 miles looking for her child. William James describes a case of an ambulatory sort, the Reverend Ansel Bourne, itinerant preacher, 30 years old, psychopath, had on several occasions attacks of unconsciousness lasting an hour. One day, January 17, 1887, he suddenly disappeared from Greene, Rhode Island, after having lifted $551 from a bank. He was missing for 2 months, during which time he ran a little grocery store in Norristown, Pennsylvania, under the name of A.J. Brown, carefully attending to all the purchases himself, although he had never done this sort of work before. On March 14, he suddenly awoke and went back home, complete amnesia for the interval. Mesnet published this case. R., 27 years old, sergeant in the African regiment, sustained an injury of the parietal bone at Béziers, suffered for a year from hemiplegia, which disappeared when the wound healed. During the illness, he had somnambulistic attacks, with marked restriction of consciousness. All the sense functions were paralyzed, except for the sense of taste and a little bit of the sense of sight. Movements were coordinated, but their performance in overcoming obstacles was severely limited. During attacks, the patient had a senseless, collecting mania. Through various manipulations, his consciousness could be given an hallucinatory content. For instance, if a stick was placed in his hand, the patient would immediately feel himself transported to a battle scene, put himself on guard, see the enemy approaching, etc. Guinon and Sophie Woltke made the following experiments with hysterics. A blue glass was held in front of a female patient during an hysterical attack, and she regularly saw a picture of her mother in the blue sky. A red glass showed her a bleeding wound, a yellow one an orange cellar, or a lady in a yellow dress. Mesnet's case recalls the cases of sudden restriction of memory. Macnish tells a case of the sort. An apparently healthy young woman suddenly fell into an abnormally long sleep, apparently with no prodromal symptoms. On waking, she had forgotten the words for and all knowledge of the simplest things. She had to learn how to read, write, and count all over again, at which she made rapid progress. After a second prolonged sleep, she awoke as her normal self, with no recollection of the intervening state. These states alternated for more than 4 years, during which time consciousness showed continuity within the 2 states, but was separated by amnesia from the consciousness of the normal state. These selected cases of various kinds of changes in consciousness each throw some light on our case. Nave's case presents 2 hysteriform lapses of memory, one of which is characterized by delusional ideas, and the other, by its long duration, restriction of consciousness and a desire to wander. Peculiar, unexpected impulses are particularly clear in Proust and Mesnet. In our case, the corresponding features would be the impulsive tearing up of flowers and the digging up of graves. The patient's continuity of consciousness during attacks reminds us of a way consciousness behaved in the Macnish case. Hence, it may be regarded as a temporary phenomenon of alternating consciousness. The dreamlike, hallucinatory content of restricted consciousness in our case does not, however, appear to justify us in assigning it without qualification to this double consciousness group. The hallucinations in the second state show a certain creativeness, which seems to be due to its autosuggestibility. In Mesnet's case, we observe the appearance of hallucinatory processes through simple simulations of touch. The patient's subconscious uses these simple perceptions for the automatic construction of complicated scenes, which then take possession of his restricted consciousness. We have to take a somewhat similar view of the hallucinations of our patient. At any rate, the outward circumstances in which they arose seem to strengthen this conjecture. The walk in the cemetery induced the vision of the skeletons, and the meeting with the three boys evoked the hallucination of children buried alive, whose voices the patient heard at night. She came to the cemetery in somnambulistic condition, which on this occasion was particularly intense in consequence of her having taken alcohol. She then performed impulsive actions, of which her subconscious at least received certain impressions. The part played here by alcohol should not be underestimated. We know from experience that it not only acts adversely on these conditions, but like every other narcotic, it increases suggestibility. The impressions received in somnambulism go on working in the subconscious to form independent growths, and finally reach perception as hallucinations. Consequently, our case is closely allied to the somnambulistic dream states that have recently been subjected to penetrating study in England and France. The gaps of memory, apparently lacking content at first, acquire such through incidental autosuggestions, and this content builds itself up automatically to a certain point. Then, probably under the influence of the improvement now beginning, its further development comes to a standstill, and finally disappears altogether as recovery sets in. Binet and Fear have made numerous experiments with the implanting of suggestions in states of partial sleep. They have shown, for instance, that when a pencil is put into the anesthetic hand of a hysteric, she will immediately produce long letters in automatic writing, whose content is completely foreign to her consciousness. Cutaneous stimuli in anesthetic regions are sometimes perceived as visual images, or at least as vivid and unexpected visual ideas. These independent transmutations of simple stimuli must be regarded as a primary phenomenon in the formation of somnambulistic dream pictures. In exceptional cases, analogous phenomena occur even within the sphere of waking consciousness. Goethe, for example, says that when he sat down, lowered his head, and vividly conjured up the image of a flower, he saw it undergoing changes of its own accord, as if entering into new combinations of form. In the half-waking state, these phenomena occur fairly often, as the hypnagogic hallucinations. Goethe's automatisms differ from truly somnambulistic ones, because in his case, the initial idea is conscious, and the development of the automatism keeps within the bounds laid down by the initial idea, that is to say, within the purely motor of visual area. If the initial area sinks below the threshold, or if it was never conscious at all, and its automatic development encroaches on areas in the immediate vicinity, then it is impossible to differentiate between waking automatisms and those of the somnambulistic state. This happens, for instance, if the perception of a flower associates itself with the idea of a hand plucking the flower, or with the idea of the smell of a flower. The only criterion of distinction is then simply more or less. In one case, we speak of normal waking hallucinations, and in the other, of somnambulistic dream visions. The interpretation of our patient's attacks as hysterical becomes more certain if we can prove that the hallucinations were probably psychogenic in origin. This is further supported by her complaints, headache, and tendovaginitis, which proved amenable to treatment by suggestion. The only aspect that the diagnosis of hysteria does not take sufficiently into account is the etiological factor, for which we would, after all, expect a priori that, in the course of an illness which responds so completely to a rest cure, features would now and then be observed, which could be interpreted as symptoms of exhaustion. The question then arises whether the early lapses of memory and the later somnambulistic attacks can be regarded as states of exhaustion or as neurasthenic crisis. We know that psychopathic inferiority can give rise to various kinds of epileptoid attacks, whose classification under epilepsy or hysteria is at least doubtful, to quote Westphal. On the basis of numerous observations, I maintain that the so-called epileptoid attacks form one of the commonest and most frequent symptoms in the group of diseases we reckon among the mental diseases and neuropathies, and that the mere appearance of one or more epileptic or epileptoid attacks is not decisive either for the character and form of the disease or for its course and prognosis. As already mentioned, I have used the term epileptoid in the widest sense of the attack itself. The epileptoid elements in our case are not far to seek. On the other hand, one can object that the coloring of the whole picture is hysterical in the extreme. As against this, we must point out that not every case of somnambulism is ipso facto hysterical. Occasionally, states occur in typical epilepsy, which to experts seem directly parallel with somnambulistic attacks, or which can be distinguished from hysteria only by occurrence of genuine convulsions. As Deal has shown, neurasthenic inferiority may also give rise to crisis, which often confuse diagnosis. A definite content of ideas can even repeat itself in stereotype form in each crisis. Morton, too, has recently published the case of an epileptoid neurasthenic twilight state. I'm indebted to Professor Blauler for the following case. An educated gentleman of middle age with no epileptic antecedents had worn himself out with years of mental overwork. Without any prodromal symptoms such as depression, etc., he attempted suicide on a holiday. In a peculiar twilight state, he suddenly threw himself into the water from a crowded spot on the river bank. He was immediately hauled out and had only a vague memory of the incident. With these observations in mind, we must certainly allow neurasthenia a considerable share in the attacks of our patient. The headaches and the tendovaginitis point to a mild degree of hysteria, normally latent but becoming manifest under the stress of exhaustion. The genesis of this peculiar illness explains the above-described relationship to epilepsy, hysteria, and neurasthenia. To sum up, Ms. E suffers from a psychopathic inferiority with a tendency to hysteria. Under the influence of nervous exhaustion, she has fits of epileptoid stupor, whose interpretation is uncertain at first sight. As a result of an unusually large dose of alcohol, the attacks develop into definite somnambulism with hallucinations, which attach themselves to fortuitous external perceptions in the same way as dreams. When the nervous exhaustion is cured, the hysteriform symptoms disappear. In the realm of psychopathic inferiority with hysterical coloring, we meet with numerous phenomena, which show, as in this case, symptoms belonging to several different clinical pictures, but which cannot with certainty be assigned to any one of them. Some of these states are already recognized as disorders in their own right, for example, pathological lying, pathological dreamness, etc., but many of them still await thorough scientific investigation. At present, they belong more or less to the domain of scientific gossip. Persons with habitual hallucinations and also those who are inspired exhibit these states. They draw the attention of the crowd to themselves, now as poets or artists, now as saviors, prophets or founders of new sects. The genesis of the peculiar mentality of these people is for the most part lost in obscurity, for it is only very rarely that one of these singular personalities can be subjected to exact observation. In view of the sometimes great historical significance of such persons, it were much to be wished that we had enough scientific material to give us closer insight into the psychological development of their peculiarities. Apart from the now practically useless productions of the pneumatological school at the beginning of the 19th century, there is a remarkable dearth of competent observations in the German scientific literature of the subject. Indeed, there seems to be a real aversion to investigation in this field. For facts so far gathered, we are indebted almost exclusively to the labors of French and English workers. It therefore seems at least desirable that our literature should be enlarged in this respect. These reflections have prompted me to publish some observations which will perhaps help to broaden our knowledge of the relations between hysterical twilight states and the problems of normal psychology.